Unstoppable, a book by W.P. Thrift, read by name redacted. Chapter 6, Abandoning What's Not Valuable. Lucia played along a rocky cliff, weaving her golden chalice around in the air and making cawing noises with her mouth, pretending the chalice was a toy griffin. She smiled and laughed as she ran around with her new toy, her feet splashing in tiny streams of water which rolled over the rocks, nearly making her slip at one point. She quickly regained her balance before carrying on playfully. They had come to rest near a stream, and Elizabeth sat uphill from Lucia, leaning against a tree while she sharpened her sword. The morning spiders happened 2 days ago now, and her sword was still worn down from just how many of those monstrous things she had to slice through. Several sharpening and polishing later, and it had only faintly begun to regain its lost luster. It was a slow, methodical process, and one which the trained knight took great pleasure in doing thoroughly. It was meditative to her, watching the sword gleam as she polished it down with a fine, well-worn cloth before taking the sharpening stone to it again. Glancing up to watch Lucia play, she smirked. The child had gotten over so many traumas so quickly, it reminded her of herself, frankly. Their journey through the woods since the morning of spiders had been relatively uneventful, as monsters tended to thin out the closer they came to human civilization. Just before they'd left the deepest part of the forest, the last stretch still covered by the claw-like shadows of the Von Dread mountainside, Elizabeth had spotted a cave surrounded by scare-humans, which were hung-up human skeletons of past intruders, indicating a troll civilization existed within the caverns. In a parallel world, she would have beelined into that cave to ransack it for all it was worth, slaying any troll that dared try and stop her. However, Elizabeth had grown increasingly concerned for Lucia's safety the more time passed, and her primary concern had shifted from amassing treasure to seeing Lucia safely back home. Once she knew the girl was safe, she could get back to her life of treasure hunting. My gruelingly boring life of treasure hunting, without any challenge, without any sense of accomplishment or progress or... Elizabeth shook her head clear of those thoughts. She'd had them so many times before, and they never served to do anything other than bring her to a very dark place. She just had to keep her mind shut and keep working this thankless job. She just had to keep moving from point A to point B, gather all the treasure, nick all the tat, vendor it all to the local merchants until they were slap out of coins, and then hand off all the coins to her grandfather's debtors. Rinse, repeat. That was her life. That was the life she had chosen for herself. You, a knight? Her grandfather had shouted at her when he discovered this. Stop playing make-believe, girl. Come this instant and marry this nice lad. That's the only way you'll ever be useful to me. A sneer crossed her lips as she brought the sharpening stone down the sword harder and harder. Your mother and I allowed you to play knight for long enough, her father had said, backing his dad's words. But maybe it'd be for the best if you put away childish things and started to live a proper life? I'm not playing knight. I am a knight, or at least I was one before grandfather had me removed from the ranks of King's army. Which means I'm not a knight anymore. You're right, I'm only playing as a knight, but I'm not one. I'm nobody. I'm homeless. I'm worthless. I'll live my life to pay off your debt just to try and prove you wrong about me. What kind of life is this? What's even the point of it? Snip. A chip of her sword snapped off and went flying out of sight into the stream. This snapped her out of her trance and back to reality. She looked down the stream, where it ran right past the rocks Lucia was playing on and off into the deep abyss that was the lowlands. Lucia continued to play, unperturbed and unaware of Elizabeth's momentary trance. She checked her sword again. It was only missing a tiny chip, but she had broken her own sword by running the sharpening stone down it too hard. Frowning, she tapped it against a rock. It seemed to have otherwise maintained its integrity. Letting out a sigh, she got back to sharpening her sword, wondering how long it would be before she could find a better sword to replace it with. Lucia slipped a bit on one of the wet rocks and smacked her ankle against another rock while quickly trying to regain balance. Flinching from momentary pain, she dropped the chalice she'd been playing with. It hit the rock and began to roll away. She let out a squeak of surprise before scurrying after it. Let it go, Elizabeth called over to her half-heartedly, expecting the girl to immediately obey and cease running. She didn't, though. Lucia could only see the massive, blazing inferno in her mind of the spider pit, as the shrieks of the burning spiders echoed in a chorus of agony into the air. She knew the value of treasure, and it scared her to death to imagine that golden chalice falling into the vast, unreachable lowlands. The chalice reached the edge of the final rock and flipped over the edge, the base of the chalice catching on the rock and holding there the cup of infinite value dangling upside down. Lucia slowed her movement as she crept more slowly over to the chalice, reaching out for it carefully. Yee-ah! Lucia slipped, and her weight caused her to rocket towards the edge of the cliff as quickly as if she were going down a slide. Her one thought wasn't to grab anything else to save herself with, only to reach for the chalice, and it fell away and off into the abyss long before she arrived, her body rocketing off the side, nothing around her to grab hold of anymore, only air around her and the infinite abyss below. W.O.P. Her wrist was grabbed so suddenly that her shoulder popped where it had been dislodged days before, her whole body instantly trembling in phantom pain summoned up from the memory of that moment. Elizabeth stood over the edge of the cliff, grasping Lucia tightly around her wrist, and then she pulled the child back up and roughly tossed her to the ground, where she squirmed and flailed from both pain and embarrassment of having just lost the golden chalice of the old gods. No, you let the chalice go! Lucia's teeth were gritted, her shoulder hurt, her wrist hurt, but she kicked at the ground only out of outrage that a lone piece of treasure had been lost. Child, what in the name of the gods do you think you're doing, disobeying me like that? Elizabeth shouted at her loud enough to make all the birds for miles take off flying from the trees. Lucia's tantrum stopped immediately. She froze up, then sat up, her eyes wide as she pulled herself into a defensive ball. She'd never seen Elizabeth look so furious before, and it scared her to her core. One had to save the chalice, Lucia said meekly, the words barely audible. I told you to let it go. Elizabeth stomped, shattering quite a large rock beneath her foot, and breaking off a hunk of it which went falling off the cliff and down into the endless abyss. It's all I have, though. Lucia clenched her knees tightly with both hands, but her eyes moved to the seams of her dress. Despite being washed out several times now, days of traveling through the woods had reduced it to tatters. Her next words were choked out, gurgled from snot running down her throat and face. It's the only thing I have that's worth anything. Elizabeth loomed over her like a titan. Her expression dropped from fury to a blank canvas. The knight stepped away from the girl and walked across the rocks, and then back up the small hill towards the tree she'd been sitting beneath. Lucia wondered if her scolding was over, if Elizabeth would just be mad at her at this point, and that would be all there was to it. She was quite wrong. Instead, Elizabeth grabbed the massive burlap sack of treasure, nearly 500 terms of unspeakable riches and enchanted objects containing enough magic to unmake and remake the world twice over. She walked with the bag back towards Lucia, whose assumption had now shifted to Elizabeth possibly wanting to give her a new toy out of the bag, something to replace her chalice with. Her tears gradually stopped, assuming that Elizabeth wasn't mad at her but rather pitied her. Was that it? Nope, that wasn't right either. Without hesitation, Elizabeth hurled the massive sack of treasure off the edge of the cliff and down into the abyss below, into the unreachable no-man's land of the lowlands. Lucia screamed in genuine shock and awe at the sight of this. Elizabeth had just thrown away everything of value she owned, all at once. It was all gone now. Crawling back to her feet, Lucia began to run towards the edge of the cliff to look over it and watch the burlap sack fall out of view, but Elizabeth sternly shouted, "Stop!" And this time Lucia listened. Lucia turned back towards Elizabeth with fear and horror etched on her face, and demanded of the knight, "Why?" Elizabeth, face still attempting to be blank but cracking at the seams, hints of sorrow on the edges of her eyes and lips, knelt down to bring her face even with Lucia's. She put a hand on the girl's shoulder, the shoulder she'd hurt twice now. She gave a slight squeeze, very briefly. Do you know what's worthless? That garbage is worthless. Its meaning... But... It has no value whatsoever, Elizabeth shouted, interrupting Lucia's protest. Do you know what's valuable? You are! You have value! I never again want to hear you say that you have no worth, that you have no value, that you don't belong in this world. Lucia hadn't said any of those things. Elizabeth was seeing too much of herself in this child. All the same, her message came through. I'm more valuable than all of that treasure? Lucia sucked up snot while trying to say the words clearly. Yes, the two cannot even be compared. Lucia rushed Elizabeth to hug her, and the knight was glad when Lucia couldn't see her face anymore, because she could finally stop holding back her tears. When Lucia let go, Elizabeth quickly looked away so that she could wipe her eyes off before she turned back. She did her best to keep her expression as a solid slab of steel. You still have your whole life ahead of you, Elizabeth thought. You can still be anything. I'll make certain of that. Whomever your parents or guardian is, I'll make certain they let you become whoever you want to be. Your life is your own. Because your life has value, meaning, purpose. Unlike mine. It was early the next morning when they crossed the large wooden bridge and returned to Winterdress proper. The fairly small rural section of the town stretched out beneath the higher tier which loomed above it, walled off so that the common folk couldn't see the homes of the more wealthy. Elizabeth hadn't been beyond that large white stone wall in ages. She sent all payments through a third party. This was by choice. She didn't want to see the family which would abandon her as they had. The rural area of town was still visited by certain nobles who weren't so pompous as to only send their servants to shop for them. They always avoided the dirtier streets, sticking to the slightly nicer shopping district where they could pretend that all was well down here in the lower tier of society. Without any goods to hawk off, Elizabeth wouldn't be visiting the shopping district today, instead sticking to the filthier back alleys on her way back to the home she was squatting in. It sat fairly isolated on the edge of town, between the last of the lamps which were lit at night marking the outskirts of the town and farmlands which stretched for many acres beyond. Before setting off down the back alley, Elizabeth paused. She turned to Lucia. Which way is your home, child? Um. Lucia had been dreading this moment. Yet, given what Elizabeth had just told her the day before, maybe she wouldn't think less of her if she found out she wasn't a noble. She decided to speak truthfully, though she still found it frightening to speak the words. My home was back under the bridge we entered on, Lucia said, looking down at the dirt. What? Elizabeth raised a brow. What do you mean? I'm asking, which noble district do you hail from, the upper tier or the upper tier? Elizabeth pointed over to massive white wall. Lucia looked over towards it, the massive wall which was only overshadowed by the Oracle Mountains which loomed even greater above that just beyond the walled-off noble district. Situated beyond the walled-off district was a secondary wall of jet-black onyx, which is where the Kingsmen lived. Representatives of their far-off king were stationed there and oversaw the training of the local knights in this area. The upper echelon of society was where Elizabeth had worked her way up to by enlisting as a knight in training. She only had a handful of truly happy memories in life, and they happened beyond that onyx wall. Liz, Lucia said in a low voice. I live under the bridge. I'm an orphan. My parents were farmers, I think. They died when I was very young, and the locals ran me out of the house, said I couldn't live there anymore. I don't know why. Elizabeth recoiled, thunderstruck at this revelation. It had genuinely never occurred to her even once that Lucia might be an urchin. But it all made sense suddenly. She had been kidnapped by bagmen, and it was very difficult to kidnap a child that someone would come looking for. Way easier to snatch one that no one will notice is missing. But moreover, this entire trip she'd never said a word about missing her parents, about missing anyone, about anyone being worried for her. That's why you said the dress was all you had of value, and then the chalice after that. Elizabeth felt dizzy. Oh, dear child, I'm so sorry I didn't realize. I'm always just so focused on the task at hand that the obvious can escape me. I knew you didn't know, but I didn't want to say, Lucia admitted. I thought you might not like me anymore if I said I wasn't a noble like you. Elizabeth shook her head. Nonsense, things like that do not matter to me. Besides, she smirked, I haven't been a noble myself in quite a long time. I'm homeless too, you know. Except, I do kind of have a place I'm squatting at. Oh? Like my bridge? Yes. Would you like to see it? I would. Elizabeth started to ask her if she'd like to stay with her for a while, but bit her lip and reconsidered what she should say next, how she should word it. I ran away because I didn't want an ordinary life. Do I really want to be tied down with? Elizabeth looked Lucia square in the eyes. Heh. I spent so long running away only to find myself right back to where I started. This is exactly what I want, and I found myself here going my own way. Would you like to be my daughter? Lucia gasped. What? Is that something you can do? Not officially she couldn't, no, but for all intents and purposes she could, and she would do exactly that. Yes, I can. 1. Even if you became my mom, could I still call you Liz? I told you not to call me Liz to begin with, Elizabeth replied, then smiled. Fine, you can call me Liz, Lucia. Lucia flinched. This was the first time Elizabeth had called her by her own name. She smiled, too, a giggle escaping her throat. Warmth swelled up within her, the likes of which she'd never known before. It was joy, pure joy and happiness. She trembled from a sudden upsurge in energy, and laughed louder as her whole face twisted into a bigger, toothier smile than she knew she could make. Yes, 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 Lucia cried out, grabbing Elizabeth by one hand and jumping up and down, shouting almost hysterically. This is going to be the best thing ever. Elizabeth's reaction was far more reserved. She felt as much joy as Lucia felt, if not more. But in equal parts another emotion flooded into her, fear. She had suddenly found everything she'd ever wanted in life, a purpose for existing, a reason to keep living. And now that she had everything, it had become possible for her to lose everything. With that sudden, terrifying thought in mind, Elizabeth gave a tiny, frightened gulp.